Welcome to Strength Chat Podcast, presented by Kabuki Strength. Introducing your hosts, Chris Duffin, the mad scientist of strength, Rudy Cadlow, mature athlete and coach, and the wizard of training himself, Brandon Sen.
Welcome to Strength Chat. Chris Duffin here, the mad scientist of strength, along with our mature athlete and coach, Dr. Rudolph. To my left.
I'm glad that stuck.
To my left is the man in the closet, Brandon. The wizard of training, Brandon Sen. So today we're really excited. We've got Patrick Ward on, and Patrick is the sports scientist for the Seattle Seahawks. And some of you might be wondering, what exactly does that mean? What does that job entail? And we'll dive into that. But we're really excited to have Patrick on. We have this funny thing here in the Northwest where we occasionally have professionals in the rehab and sports field, and we get together over what we call microbiology. But this is most of my experience with Patrick has been sitting down to drink beers. And I think you've had the same experience there as well.
That's microbiology.
That's microbiology. So no beers today, Patrick. I'm sorry.
Speak for yourself.
Dang it, we missed out.
We can see.
But welcome to the program, Patrick.
Thanks. It's great to be on and talk with you guys a little bit about the things that I get to do and hear about the things that you get to do, and hopefully just find some middle ground about how we can all use information better, right?
Exactly. So we're going to dive into a number of topics here because Patrick he probably won't take this as an insult, but he is a data and research nerd, which is why we love him. So because that's it is with training today. I mean, people have to understand that it is very science and data driven, and there's that's an important thing, and we've got to have the analysis so that we can make decisions and the right data to do so. Would you agree, Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, especially I think particularly if you're working with other people. For you guys, if you're training people, writing programs, for us, we're dealing with other people. I think whenever you're dealing with someone else's health that's not your own, it's probably really, really important to get as certain as you can about specific aspects of what you're prescribing for them, so that you can kind of feel safe because you're dealing with there's no takebacks, right? You're dealing with their most prized possession, certainly their health, and for our guys, careers. So that stuff is really, to me, it's really, really important to have data to help us understand what's taking place or explain a phenomenon. In the words of the great data scientist, statistician Edwards Deming, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And certainly, if you've ever worked in a team setting, whether that's college or professional or even high school or with little kids these days, it seems like, and I'm sure even with you guys in strength sports as well, everybody has an opinion. Coaches have opinions, and players have opinions, and managers and parents, if you're working with kids, have opinions about what their kids should and shouldn't be doing and how they should be training, even down to the junior high level, it seems like. And I always say, in a role like mine, in an analytics role, nobody's paying me for my opinion, right? They're paying me to take data, attempt to make sense of it, or find meaningful relationships, or find meaning in the data, and contextualize that for the people who have to make the decisions. So I think it's critically important to try and be as certain as you can when you're dealing with someone else's health.
Yeah, and I'm really proud of how you've been moving and progressing in the field that you've chosen, because I think when we first met, it was when you first moved to Portland. How many years ago was that?
Let's see. This is my third year in Seattle, and then prior to that, I was in Portland for 2. So
I was thinking it was
about 4 years. Yeah.
Yeah, 4 or 5 years ago. And I approached you at the time because I was really interested in auto-regulation, and you were kind of leading and had a lot of published content in regards to using the megawave system for auto-regulation, and you were employing that with basically virtual clients around the world. and using that data. And we do something very similar. We don't use that tool, but that's why I remember having some good discussions with you. But how we'll probably get into that a little bit later. But how's that kind of rolled into where you're at, and what are you looking at now? I mean, really, tell us a little bit about what is your role with the Seahawks, and what are you doing?
Yeah, so my current role is analytics. Basically, I think that the title is sports science analyst. So I get to do analytics across many different departments. It's not just physiology-based or training-based analysis of, say, what players do on the field and things like that. I get to do all kinds of different stuff. And if you think about it, like the analytics department kind of underpinning the four main decision makers, which would be management, coaching, strength and conditioning, and then the medical staff, the physical therapists and athletic trainers. And you're basically trying to provide information to them so that hopefully that can help them make decisions, or maybe check their blind spots based on stuff that they're seeing or thinking about. In terms of like the day-to-day, as far as like what a sports scientist does, if I could probably boil it down to maybe like four main things. The first being the most obvious, which is conduct scientific investigations of athlete-generated data. And that's across sports. So that's not just across the sport broadly. So that's not just physical data. Again, it's not just training data, but that could be anything like performance-related. It could be looking at college athletes and trying to understand the sport from a collegiate level and how that trickles up to the higher ranks, etc. We also set up best practice methods for data collection, which I think is really, really important, especially as more technology becomes available to the consumer. How you collect that data is going to ultimately determine the utility of that data, and whether it's clean enough to analyze, or whether it's super sloppy and messy that you're going to have a hard time drawing inference from. So I think one of the kind of key roles that a sports scientist would do is understand how to set up best practice methods. Of course, contextualize and analyze the data. And then, one of the last ones, which again, kind of going back to that technology piece, is appraising technologies or appraising you use to collect data and determining if they're useful at all. So that's things like reliability and validity and signal to noise. So I spend a considerable amount of time with technologies that we might be interested in using or looking at, and doing in-house reliability studies and understanding how repeatable is this, and what's the signal to noise in this, and is the noise so noisy that it's drowning out what might be meaningful, which means that maybe we can't really use it in our environment, and things like that. So that's kind of the day-to-day, is really, for me at least, is about evaluating data and trying to help people understand it better.
I think that last piece is important there. Is it sounds like it's, data and the tools used to collect it are very application based, right? Because I see people, here's the fun, neat new thing that's awesome out there, and everybody wants to use it and use that data. And, maybe it's not useful in your environment, or maybe that salesperson is selling you something that the technology isn't there yet.
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. I think it's really hard, and I think when you look at coaches or managers, and even the general consumer, we get our information from the media and from reading articles in a magazine or the newspaper, or hearing stuff on the news. And to someone who's not informed about either science or physiology or how that stuff works, anything seems plausible. And so for a manager or a coach, it becomes trying to keep up with the other team. Like, why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we doing that? It's like, well, because it's a waste of time. It's not going to be useful. I mean, they're doing it because they don't understand what they're doing, right? And so I think that's a really key component is instead of prioritizing the technology, you want to prioritize the person who's supposed to tell you what the technology means. And that's like the key piece, right? Is like, you want to get someone in the room who can at least evaluate it. And because, if, for us, for example, we get mountains of emails every week from new technology companies who'd love to come in and show us this, and it's going to solve all these problems, and get us on board because they'd love to have that. And they come in sometimes, and I listen and stuff, and I try and ask them really important questions about the things that they're promoting or the things they're talking about. And one of the things that I often say, though, is like, again, about prioritizing the person who can tell you what the technology means over the technology itself is, if I'm unsure of something, the first thing I say is like, look, what you're saying is very nice. I'm a bit skeptical, and I'm not an expert in this field, but let me call someone who is, to let them tell me if they feel like, in an unbiased way, this is even possible what you're saying. So I think getting the right people in the room, that's super important. And then figuring out how to best practice, collect that stuff. Like you mentioned, heart rate variability at the outset of the talk here. And that's something that can be really, really difficult to collect in a good way unless you standardize the process around, hey, wake up in the morning, take a pee, put the heart rate strap on, lie back down, hit the button, yada yada yada. That makes it really challenging in our environment because guys don't do that. Football players don't. They don't necessarily do that kind of stuff when they wake up in the morning, and
I know
so you
football
can't collect
players
it.
pee.
What's that?
I know football players pee. I know.
They do pee, but they're not very good at putting on heart rate straps for some reason. Like
following directions like
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Probably
Why
not.
is this? Why is the data upside down? You put the heart rate strap upside down. So yeah. So finding how to collect the data sometimes is the most challenging piece, and ultimately going to make or break the system.
I was interested, just a side note on the heart rate variability. I used that for about a year.
Yeah.
After our discussion, and it was really interesting. It definitely saw the correlation between my training and, but yeah, just small things like application based, like, through the year I changed like my supplementation, and some things with my supplementation change like my water retention. I noticed when I'm holding more water, my HRV measurements would change substantially, and it had and it was totally based on that. And if I wasn't smart enough to know that and know like the changes that would, that could really mess you up and think that I need and drive changes to my training program when there shouldn't have been any.
Well, and that brings up another really important point too. Is when you're looking at that stuff, a lot of the technologies that are out there are built to make things simple for the end user. And within that simplicity are these kind of stock general analysis of your heart rate variability. But think about that, like the thresholds set within whatever system you're using are specific to whomever they built those thresholds off of, which could be 50,000 housewives walking their dog every day, which has nothing to do with you as a strength athlete, and it might have nothing to do with someone else who's an endurance athlete, yet you're using the same thresholds because that's how those systems are built. And so, pulling raw data and coming up with your own thresholds or your own analysis, like with a lot of our stuff, we apply probability that the change that I see today is a real change. So if we use a simple example like a scale, and I have you step on the scale and it says, 250 pounds, and then you step off and you step on again and it says 248. We do that a few times, and what's the error measurement within that? And then if you come in tomorrow and you step on and it says 246, well, what's the probability that giving the known error that 246 is actually a real change and something that we need to get Chris more fluids. Maybe he's dehydrated, or why is he losing weight, or whatever. Maybe it's just a total normal occurrence within the error of the system. So understanding those things is really, really important.
And like you said, also analyzing the technology. I mean, the scale thing that you just brought up, I've noticed a lot of. If you go into a home goods store and you look at just a standard bathroom scales, they all say repeatable within 0.1%. And if you get on them repeatedly, they'll keep putting that out. But if you grab a 10-pound plate and get on and then get off without it, and you go back and forth, you'll find that they've actually written into the algorithm and it throws it off, because now all of a sudden your weights will bounce all over the place. But they basically, in a lot of those scales, so we're not talking a quality professional calibrated scale, but one that you can go get at Kohl's or wherever. Try it with a 10-pound plate, get on and off.
Yeah.
Because I've gone into those stores and tried it, trying to find which scales actually are built with an algorithm to actually make them print out as repeatable, and they're not repeatable. So if you fall within the same range and the last measurement was this, it'll report the same measurement again.
That's outstanding.
So
See, there you go. Your own scientific investigation right there at Coles.
There you go.
but it's
Coles
just
is busted now.
Yeah, totally.
I shouldn't have said a certain name. I'm gonna get sued now.
Coming after Strength Chat. Shut them down. So we talked about analyzing good and bad data. What are some of I know I imagine you take data in from across the organization. What are some of the most used tools that you use specifically for your athletes in data management?
Yeah. So if we're talking training, training wise, when you think about the context of training of what an athlete does, and it doesn't matter the sport. It could be anything from endurance to strength athletes and all the team sports in between. There's a few things that we want to know about. One is we want to know about external training load, which is going to be specific to the things that the athlete actually does. So let's say you're, for example, writing a training program for a strength athlete, and you prescribe something like 5 sets of 5 at 80% on the squat. That has an external training load component. It gives you things like the tonal tonnage that the athlete did, the intensity, that 80% relative to their 1RM. It gives you an intensity. You might be using something like a GymAware system or a Tendo unit, some sort of linear position transducer that tells you about bar speed. So we want to know information about external training load within that realm for us. Primarily, that is collected through integrated microtechnology units. So things like GPS, accelerometer, gyroscope, magnetometer, those kinds of things. Then we want to know the internal response. So how the athlete actually tolerated what you prescribed and what they did. So that could be heart rate, but it could be actually wearing the heart rate monitor during a workout. We use RPE, so just a super simple rating of perceived exertion scale. And 0 to 10 multiplied by the duration of the session in minutes. That gives us an internal load marker. And then we also want how the athlete responds over time, so sort of chronically. And again, that could be heart rate variability would be a way maybe that you could do this. We use just a simple 4-question questionnaire, 0 to or 1 to 10. And then we total the results as well, so we get a kind of a total wellness. And we evaluate those over time. We know what kind of changes are meaningful for an individual, so we know when they're kind of going downhill or actually even getting better or adapting the right way. So those are the simple things. We use sleep monitoring a little bit as well, but those are the main things that we'll look at. And the cool thing is that they're simple and easy to do. I mean, and they're cheap with the exception of the microtechnology stuff. Questionnaires and stuff are really cheap. And if you're looking at like heart rate variability, I've done some work like this before where we've looked at heart rate variability and just how the athlete subjectively rates their wellness. And, the correlation, the within individual correlation has been quite strong to the point where it's like, well, do we really need to spend $3,000 on heart rate variability if the correlation is so high and we educate the athletes on how the questionnaire works and what they're answering to? You might capture some good information with that and then not have to spend, you can spend the money in other ways.
Right. That's an important point. I think a lot of people miss all the time because they want to just get the technology and collect the data for data's sake. And unless you're actually needing it to drive a decision in the end, and I could see in your role that you would probably capture more data than an individual athlete or someone would want to. But I always push our athletes, like, if you're not making decisions based on data, don't collect it. Like, if it's not,
I think,
no action.
I think actually in our world too, I think I'm actually probably more the same along the lines of what you're describing is I would rather keep things simple. It's kind of funny, like you go to, I've gone to sports science conferences all over the world and I see colleagues present these elaborate Excel dashboards of their team, and they've got like 20 different things they're collecting. And if we just use a simple like red, yellow, green traffic light system for all 20 things, what I always ask them is, okay, if we look at those 20 things on the day-to-day basis and 18 of them are green and 2 of them are red, what do you tell coach? And all the time, the person comes back and says, well, which two are red? Okay, well, these two things. Okay, well, we really don't. I mean, we have those, but we really only look at these three things. Okay, stop.
Yeah.
Get rid of 17 things, and then just try and really, really specifically describe those three things and what they mean, and use those.
And I think that what's more important there too is also clearly defining what the strategy and what you do from there. There should never be different outcomes. So my background and how why I drive this is I come from manufacturing, and there's a lot of SPC, statistical process control. Yeah. And so it's the same thing. Like for 30 years, people just collected data and presented it, and look at these charts, look at my machine. And I drove for okay, if this happens at this point, okay, now it's out of control. Now you perform this maintenance or this preventative maintenance. Okay, still not in control. You call the maintenance tech. So there was very specific actions that took place, and that actually drove improvement in performance instead of just collecting data and going, oh well, maybe we should do something or maybe we shouldn't. It was clearly defining under these parameters, this is what we do.
Yeah, I think, two things to that. One is a lot of it comes down to the question that you're trying to answer. A lot of times people tell me or ask me hey, should I get this technology to collect this? And my first thing is always, well, what are you trying to understand with your athletes? Because this might not even tell you that. And I think a lot of people, it's like the wild, wild west, right? Like shoot first, ask questions later. It's collect data, ask questions later. Well, that doesn't really work. And your example is actually a good one. Control charting is something that I use quite a bit, actually, because if you think about what we're dealing with when we're training an athlete or dealing with an athlete over time, let's say you've got a big powerlifting meet you're getting someone ready for in the next 15 weeks, you're dealing with time series data. You're dealing with repeated measures over time. And, if we just go by general exercise science statistics, nobody ever really talks about the fact that, hey, in the real world, we're not just designing a study with a pre and post test. We have to test people every single day and gather information. And sometimes some information, data goes missing, and sometimes weird things happen. And control charting is actually a great way to look at time series analysis of humans and just say hey, you know what? We're up here for the past 3 or 4 days. That probably means something bad. You'd call the engineer. We'd probably send you to the physio, right?
Exactly.
It's the same kind of idea.
It's a process, right? I
mean, so as we're talking about collecting data, there might be an assumption by our listeners that all the data we're collecting, we're talking about strength and conditioning, might be on how quick, how strong, how fast, how much weight over time, whatever. But when you spoke early on about what the 4 measurements or the 4 groups that need your data, I think you said management, coaching, strength and conditioning, and the training staff. Ultimately, those people have to make a decision sometimes that is subjective, given the fact that they've got all this objective data. Question I have is, are you measuring any behavioral patterns? Do you measure how often somebody's late for a meeting, or they show up late for work, or some of the questionnaires for a training staff, for example, scale of 1 to 10, how you feeling today? Well, the guy wants to get back on the field. He says scale of 1 to 10, the pain's 3, but it's really a 9. So the training staff has to know that guy somehow. Are you collecting data to help them make subjective decisions?
Yeah, data meetings and things like that is certainly always, attendance is always collected, right? Because, if you turn on ESPN, you'll hear about players on different teams getting fined for not showing up. So everybody knows when you're not there. That's for sure. What you bring up 2 really, really good and important points. The first one being that we're probably dealing more with social science than we are sports science in terms of trying to elicit some sort of behavior change, whether it's from people making decisions and breaking the mold of things that they've always done because that's how they've always done it, or behavior change with regards to the way that a player might do something in terms of, say, just general health, how they manage their life. So understanding that is really, really important. I would say to that point, and to the question you're asking, there's a statistician in the UK, and he has a quote like all decisions. How does it go? It says all decisions should be based on evidence, but best decisions should be based on previous experience as well, or include previous experience. And he wrote that in reference to Bayesian statistics, which is a type of statistical analysis, a type of conditional probability that takes into account the observed data, the things that we observe from the player, as well as prior information that we might have, either subjectively, the coach's eye, the art of coaching, things like that. And it basically brings them together to give us this kind of forward-thinking probability of what we might expect to take place. And the reason I like that quote is because it really reminds us that, science is helpful, but science is not as objective as people would like it to be. There's a lot of subjectivity in science as well. And in a coaching environment, the coach's eye, the art of coaching, is really, really important. And the coach's relationship with their athletes is really, really important, and it's not something to be taken lightly. So I don't think it's always data all the time, but I think more the two play a role in sort of checking their blind spots. And there's going to be some days where the coach's eye is the rear view mirror and the data just serves to be the side view mirror and make sure there's nothing coming up on the right-hand lane. And then other days it might flip-flop where the data might uncover something that's really interesting that the coach might not have been aware of. And then we blend that with the side view mirror of the art, the coach's eye and the intuitive nature of coaches. And we try to come to a conclusion on what the best approach or the best way to proceed forward would be.
Yeah, clearly having all the objective data sure helps in making a subjective decision. It's the old axiom is you can measure the size of the dog in the fight, but not so easy to measure the fight in the dog, and so that's where the coach's decision, or management, when they decide, I've got two guys, got an opportunity to pick up somebody else, but this guy's a step slower than the other guy, but he's got more heart, and I got to make a decision.
Yeah, that's stuff that exactly. That's stuff that data, hard data can't help you with. Knowing the person, a scout is going to know a kid much better. They're going to meet the kid and the kid's parents and the coach, the position coach and the teachers and all that stuff. All I know is what gets reported in the box score. Right. I just know the hard data, and it's important to keep in mind that people aren't Excel sheets; they're people. And I think Tony Strudwick at Manchester United had a good quote, something like, "We don't train Excel sheets; we train human beings." And so, data can only tell us so much, and all models are bad. All models are broken. It's just some are worse than others, and you constantly have to iterate those models to be able to explain new information coming in.
I really love the way that you're articulating a lot of this stuff, Patrick. I mean, it's very, we've got a similar process here. We've got a team of virtual, athletes around the globe that we work with, and we analyze the data. But Brandon and I have this discussion quite a bit. We've got all these models that we use, we analyze it, but a big part of it is also learning that athlete through the process as well, and it's critical. So.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, even, it's funny, like with probability, there's always the complement of the probability, So if you say, well, there's a 60% chance that this guy might pull a hamstring if we train too hard today, there's still a 40% chance that he's not going to, right? And so sometimes the coach's eye is like, look, you know what, we're going to do some things. I think he can handle it. And God willing, nothing happens.
So that's a very interesting topic. How predictable can we make things through the training process with the data that's collected?
The first would be what's the question? Like, what are you trying to predict, right?
So,
I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think some things might be more predictable than others. The hard thing is humans are really, really complex. And if you look at most of the literature on trying to predict stuff in sport, I guess not not like on the analytics side in terms of like sporting outcomes and stuff like that, but more towards like injury or health side of things. There's not a lot of great research on that for the main reason is everybody assumes these like linear relationships between things. Like, oh, if his if his ankle dorsiflexion is bad, he's gonna automatically get hurt. Well, there could be like a billion reasons why he doesn't get hurt. Maybe he's more robust. Maybe he has a different squatting strategy that doesn't make his knee hurt or his hip hurt or his low back hurt or whatever it may be. Or maybe he has that limitation and you as the coach recognize that and you program less amount of volume so that he never gets to a state where under fatigue he reaches those limits and then he does get hurt. There's never this linear relationship. There's all these factors that go into it. And if I think about the things that, like, when I think about training that are important to me, it's like a triangle. And at the top of the triangle is stress resistance and stress tolerance. So how good is that person at being able to tolerate the stressors that are placed on them, whether they're placed on them from us as coaches or whether they're placed on them from their external environment, be it like family stress and financial stress and job stress and everything else that they go through. How well do they tolerate it? Because it's really an ecosystem. It's like everything within an ecosystem is dependent on each other. It's the water. Like if I walk outside in Seattle here, I can walk to Lake Washington, and it's like the water is really nice, and because the water is nice, the grass grows and the plants grow and the birds eat the fish, and the fish, If I walk to where I grew up in Cleveland in Lake Erie, it's like everything's dead and the water's and nothing's alive. Like a little bit of stress ruins everything. So stress tolerance is at the top of that triangle. How does the person tolerate their stress? And then the other two edges of that triangle would be the fitness of the person. And so that could be just your basic stuff like fitness in terms of strength and power output and cardiovascular fitness and all the components of that. And then the movement of the person. And that's like everything from like, do they have the joint ranges of motion to satisfy the demands of the sport that they're trying to play? Biomechanical analysis. You guys are going to watch someone squat or deadlift or bench press, and you're going to see something very, very different in your evaluation or your appraisal of that squat or deadlift or bench press than the basic trainer down the street at 24-hour fitness. You guys have a different eye to that stuff. So it's that kind of analysis or just general movement type of analysis, those kinds of things. And within those three things, they all interact with each other. So trying to assume this linear relationship between one of those things like poor movement and injury is really, that's such a leap to come to. And that's probably why much of the research on things like this haven't uncovered anything really, really valuable. Or if they've uncovered stuff, it's always retrospective data. It's always it's more like a history lesson than it is applying or providing us with inference going forward in terms of things to look for. So I think part of it is probably just limitations in maybe not having enough information, limitations in the things we collect, and then probably the actual analysis of things. So maybe trying to use, moving towards more things like multi-state models and things like that can take in lots of inputs and maybe evaluate these things, these injury risk outcomes. But there hasn't been a ton of great stuff like that. So I think it makes, that one of the things that makes it challenging is just the complexity of human and trying to account for all those factors.
Yeah, and talking about the human element of it, I've heard stories from different team sport coaches when collecting data, how much do you have to actually worry about the athlete that you're collecting data from trying to actually game the system that you're trying to manage? I mean, how big of a concern is that for you as a data analyst?
Well, with anything like questionnaire based, an athlete can always lie. and that's that's one of the things. I get that's one of the limitations, and every system has limitations and errors. So as long as you're upfront and you recognize the error and the bias, that's the first step. So athletes can lie. This is true. One of the things is when you start to analyze the data, you'll know automatically, if they always put in the same number or something like that. Like that's really easy to rule out because they have no variance.
Right.
So you have a conversation with them, and if they don't want to do it, that's fine. Then just move along. Like it might not be the best thing to interact with them on. Something like GPS and the accelerometer data. There's no way to game that. You either practiced or you didn't, right? So you either had like a really hard training session and they beat the crap out of you, or they took it easy on you. There's no real way to game that. Similar to like bar velocity. Like you can't game it. Like you either move the bar fast or you didn't.
I'll disagree with that. But it's to the point of asking the right question first, right? So I've seen some strength team coaches use like bar velocity as the primary measurement of being better.
Okay.
So you get people doing a deadlift with a big, with a hitch on the top or up on their toes, or because they're looking at the wrong thing, and so they're going to get. People are going to do things that actually may be poor movement quality to improve velocity, and that's just you've got to know how to ask the right questions. So.
Yeah, that comes down to the data collection.
Yep.
Right? Like, it's like you watch, if you go on YouTube and you pull up any of those videos of like the colleges on their testing days, and they got the kid, it's like, oh, this kid squatted 500 pounds. And it's like, well, he barely squatted to like 50 degrees of knee flexion. It's the sloppiest thing ever. It's like, bend. How are you even calling that like something of value? That's just,
I've seen some of
that is
you've seen some of those where it's like, those people have jobs. Like, it's pretty crazy. Although there's a few out there that are really incredible when you watch those videos, and it's like, wow, their S&C coaches have their stuff together.
I got mad at
seeing the NFL 225 bench press for reps isn't always accurate.
just bouncing it and not extending your elbows. Yeah, you're right. There's some really. I mean, the kid from Auburn has great videos. The guys at Citadel and Army, they all have really good, really good stuff. I always appreciate watching the stuff that they do.
Yeah, I love those Auburn videos. They're pretty good.
Oh, yeah, I don't know that guy. I don't even know who he is, but he does a really good job. But you see others, some of the videos I see, and I'm just like, in my head, I'm thinking, if you're the athletic director of the school, how do you, on like good conscience, walk into the gym and say like, this guy's doing a really great job for us.
That's what I mean.
I don't get that. It doesn't make sense, but it is what it is.
I wouldn't even publish that. I don't know.
You gotta imagine some of that's on the S&C coach. I mean, he's it's gotta make him sound better to his head coach and athletic director when he can report 100-pound improvements in all of the primary lifts over the course of a season.
No question. That becomes that's the old debate of, are you chasing numbers or are you chasing health, right? Am I actually making you better, or am I just cooking the books, I'd rather make the kid better.
Yep.
I think part of it is in our country with organized team sport, this is very different compared to, if you go to Australia or the UK, everything is in a club. And within that club, the kid is developed until they're 18, and then a decision is made. You either play professionally or you don't. And but there's this developmental strategy, and the kid trusts the club, and the club trusts the kid, and they work together, and they help them progress. In our country, organized team sport is such a pressure to win, because at each level, it's the ego of the coach who's trying to move up to the next level that's holding them back. And so that high school coach, doesn't give a darn about the running back. He's going to ride him all the way to the state championship. And he doesn't care if that kid does anything else other than help him win a state championship so he can hopefully move up to a higher level in college and get more money. And when that kid goes to college, they're going to ride the hell out of him until he gets to the national championship game, and they win it. And they don't care if he has a successful NFL career, because they just want to win national championships and make a lot of money and hopefully get promoted to new jobs or move into the NFL. And by the time of these kids get to the highest level, and that goes for any NFL, NBA, you see it in all these sports. Sometimes the best kids end up fizzling out because they've wasted all their reps. Like they got no bullets in the chamber because the coach beat the crap out of them for his own ego rather than stepping back and saying, geez, this kid is an exceptional talent. Can I develop him for 4 years and then hand him off to the next guy who can then hopefully hand him off to the highest level so he can play his 10 years in the league and have a good living and support his family for the rest of his life doing the thing that he loves to do. That doesn't happen, though.
Yeah, I suspect that same thing can apply to some parents in America, pushing
Oh,
kids,
no question. What is the quote? It's like for every one Tiger Woods, there's 500 kids who hate their dad or something like that.
You talked about the dashboard, coaches tracking 20 things, and proud of the red, white, the red, yellow, green. Yeah. And then you said, well, maybe there's only 3 or 4 things that really matter, so just measure those. Let me ask you, and maybe you can't boil it down, and it probably changes by position, but for you and your organization, what are the top 3, 4, 5, let's say for offensive linemen that you're trying to use versus, say, defensive backs?
Yeah, so football is a really interesting sport in that it's really like 11 different sports going on at the same time because you have 11 players and they all have positional demands. A slot wide receiver could be very different than a wide receiver who runs the go route, and a guard is different than a tackle, is different than a center, and your running back and fullback are different, and you have a tight end who blocks and a tight end who catches, and the same thing on the defense. It's really interesting to think about the differences. So it's not a homogeneous group either. You have small guys and you got big guys and you got tall guys and short guys and muscly guys and fatter guys and everything in between. So trying to understand the sporting demands, it makes it very challenging. With accelerometer data and GPS data, what you try and do is break things down into what the actual tasks or the demands are for that position group. Offensive linemen, obviously, anybody who's watched a game knows that they don't run very much. So using locomotor data to describe what an offensive lineman did, like high-speed running, how useless would that be? Like, you're not going to tell the coach anything interesting. But accelerometer data that gives you things like forces, accelerations or G-forces, gravitational forces, the load placed on that individual's body when they come out of, fire out of their stance and hit a guy or push off each other and or even hold an isometric and try and block a defensive lineman in place. That might be more telling. But flip that for the guys who run, for the wide receivers, there's not a whole lot of that. But using more of a locomotor type of metric is going to be more useful for those guys. So it's really boils down to finding or understanding a little bit about the ergonomics of the sport, and then what are the ways to kind of quantify those ergonomics and be able to describe what's taking place.
Excellent. I think we have a little bit of loop feedback there, but
oh yeah, you guys froze for a second.
Yeah, so did you. We're about wrapping up here. I'm going to hit you with one more top 3 question, like Rudy did. So assume people want to get more into data collection and analyzing this stuff. What are some resources that they can take from to learn about that?
Yeah, I took statistics in college and all that stuff, and it's a really boring. It's boring. there's no other way around it. And I think
I love
one
regression
of the reasons,
analysis. What are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly. One of the reasons why I think it's boring is because they're usually talking about things you aren't interested in. So one of the ways that I learned a lot of the things that I learned, besides having good teachers and PhD professors along the way who have helped me or guide me, is through simulation. So a lot of times I'll read studies and then I'll think about the study and I'll build a simulation of the data based on what they've provided about the about the distribution of the data, so means and standard deviation. And I'll build that simulation, and then I'll try and utilize their statistical approach to apply to that simulation to see how the analysis works and to see what kind of outcomes I come up with. And then I'll try different approaches and other things to try and understand those kinds of approaches. So resources for me were more about reading lots of research papers and trying to really dissect the statistical portion or the statistical description of what was taking place in those papers. So lots of textbooks, and then all I would do is I would just go line by line. Like, what does this mean? How is this calculated? What exactly are they trying to do? And then just trying to build some simulations of data and then practicing on that before applying it to other types of data. And I would say use things that are interesting to you. So if you're interested in football or baseball or go on ESPN and just rip data. Like, that was another thing that I did a lot, was I would just rip data from ESPN or copy and paste out data from ESPN tables and analyze it. Analyze years of football data and figure out how to apply different statistical approaches. If you guys are collecting data on power lifters and that's clearly a sport of interest, don't just stop with like the basic stuff of, we got some information here and let's change training. Like, really try and drill down and understand, or try and figure out ways to understand what does this mean, or how does this, how can we look at this differently to try and come up with something interesting. I think about like Anatoly Bondarchuk, who is a throws coach, a Russian throws coach, one of the most decorated Olympic coaches of all time. And in his books, he has kind of like these three typographies of athletes, where he has like an athlete who sort of trains and trains and trains and always makes this sort of linear improvement. Then he has like the athletes that they train for a while and then they sort of have this negative dip, and then once you back off them by 20%, they have this immediate spike. And then they have athletes who train and then they have a dip and you back off of them, and then they have this gradual spike. And he's like, most of the throwers fall into one of these three categories. And he's describing this in his books, and I'm thinking like, that's really, really interesting and cool. How do we look at that for other sports? So if I was like sitting with, powerlifting data, because everything in your sport, right? Training is your sport, So like, you could probably, if you have enough data, start to come up with models that describe how certain athletes adapt and how one athlete doesn't adapt compared to others, and what are the individual differences. And that might allow you to then have different conversations about how you tweak a program that you might not have had previously. So just starting with data that is useful to you, lots of books, having some sort of background in the coding language can sometimes help, because you can handle lots of data. But certainly if you're not working with a large group of people, Excel can do lots of powerful things and pretty good.
Awesome. Well, I think we're about out of time here.
Yeah, but love the discussion, actually, and there's a number of other topics we didn't even get into, and so perhaps if you're open to it, we'd like to have you back on at some point.
Sure.
And again, great discussion. I forgot to tell you on the outset, Dr. Philip Snell dropped in right before your podcast, and he wanted to make sure to say hi to you, because we were telling him you were coming on. So.
All right, awesome. Yeah, nice.
Where can our listeners learn more about you and the services you provide or products?
I don't have any products. I guess I don't really even have services, but you can always send me an email, pward2@gmail.com. I try and answer all the emails as fast as I can. And then I have a blog that I haven't really had time to write much, but maybe I'll put the podcast up in that. And that's optimumsportsperformance.com. And so there's lots of information there on stuff that I've written since, I think since 2006, so probably a decade.
There's some good articles on there. I was going to reference that if you didn't. So
yeah, there's that, and then Twitter, OSP Patrick, @OSP Patrick, and I usually will post up articles, like journal articles that I think are interesting, or data science type of articles that might be interesting, data analysis type of things that might be interesting for people that can, they can maybe read and think about within the context of the athletes they work with, and put them into try and put them into practice.
All right,
awesome.
Thanks again, Patrick.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
All right. Go Hawks.